Everyone who watched her on screen thought they knew exactly who she was. The sunny blonde with the perfect laugh, the woman who always got the guy, the actress America trusted more than almost anyone else in Hollywood. What almost nobody knew is that the real Doris Day survived a train wreck that nearly took her leg, endured a husband who hit her while she was carrying their child, and later discovered that the man she trusted with every dollar she ever earned had quietly let it all disappear. This is why men love Doris Day, and once you hear what she actually went through, you'll understand that the smile on screen was covering up one of the toughest life stories in the history of American entertainment. Keep watching, because almost none of this ever made it into the interviews or the fan magazines of her era. Let's begin with the star the public believed they understood. Doris Mary Ann Kappelhoff came into the world on April 3, 1922, in Evanston, a suburb just outside Cincinnati, born to a German immigrant family. Her father William led the choir and played organ at their local church, a strict and reserved presence in the household. For most of her life, Doris herself thought she had actually been born 2 years later, in 1924, and it took Associated Press researchers digging up her original birth record decades afterward, close to her 95th birthday, to finally set the date straight. Around the time she turned 10, her parents split after her father's affair came out into the open, leaving her mother Alma to run the household on her own. Alma noticed early that her daughter had real talent as a dancer, and by her teenage years, Doris and her dance partner Jerry Doherty had built a local reputation good enough to catch the attention of talent scouts connected to Hollywood studios. Everything was falling into place. Then one night, without warning, it all fell apart. We'll get into exactly what happened shortly, because that single night reshaped the entire course of American entertainment history. But first, it helps to understand just how massive Doris Day's career eventually grew, because that scale makes the hidden parts of her story even more staggering. Once she recovered, dance was no longer an option, so she shifted towards singing instead, and that pivot turned out to be one of the luckiest breaks in the history of show business. She landed a spot with bandleader Les Brown's orchestra, and by 1945 she had 2 songs riding high on the national charts, Sentimental Journey and My Dreams Are Getting Better All the Time. Not long after, she launched a solo career that would eventually produce more than 600 recorded songs across roughly 2 decades. Her movie career began in 1948 with Romance on the High Seas, and from there she jumped comfortably between musicals, comedies, and dramas in a way very few of her contemporaries could match. She headlined Calamity Jane in 1953. She played opposite James Stewart in Alfred Hitchcock's The Man Who Knew Too Much in 1956, the film that introduced the world to her signature tune, Sera, Sera. She became one half of one of the most cherished on-screen duos of the era alongside Rock Hudson, teaming up for 3 romantic comedies together, including Pillow Talk in 1959, which brought her an Academy Award nomination for Best Actress. Off-screen, she and Hudson stayed close friends for the rest of their lives, and when he became one of the first major Hollywood names to publicly reveal an AIDS diagnosis in the mid-1980s, Doris was among the earliest public voices to stand by him at a moment when compassion for AIDS patients was in painfully short supply. Her filmography also put her alongside Clark Gable, Cary Grant, James Cagney, and Frank Sinatra. However you measure it, she was one of the defining faces of an entire generation of American film. When she walked away from movies in 1968, at what many in the industry considered the absolute peak of her box office pull, she pivoted into television with The Doris Day Show, which stayed on air for 5 seasons until 1973. The recognition never really slowed down after that. A Golden Globe, the Cecil B. DeMille Lifetime Achievement Honor in 1989, the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2004, a Grammy Lifetime Achievement Award in 2008, a Career Achievement Prize from the Los Angeles Film Critics Association in 2011. The same year she put out a brand new studio album that cracked the UK top 10 while she was in her late 80s. By certain measures, she stands as one of only a small handful of recording artists ever to top the American box office across 4 separate calendar years. That's the story most people already know. Here's the one she actually lived. It all traces back to a single night that was supposed to mark the beginning of everything. On October 13, 1937, a 15-year-old Doris Kappelhoff had every reason to believe her future was locked in. She and her partner Jerry Doherty had just landed a contract with an agency that supplied dancers for Hollywood film productions, and that evening friends threw them a small farewell party ahead of their move to the West Coast. The plan seemed simple enough: wrap up a handful of local shows, then head west and finally begin the career the two of them had spent close to 6 years preparing for. The drive home from that celebration is where the plan collapsed. Doris was in the car with Jerry and 2 other friends when a train slammed into their vehicle at a crossing near Hamilton, Ohio, one without gates or warning lights at that time. The impact was brutal. Her right leg was shattered in what physicians later classified as a double compound fracture. She was dragged from the wreckage screaming that her leg was broken, begging as she was carried to the ambulance for someone to reach her mother. What followed was a grueling year-long recovery, made worse by a later fall that re-injured the same leg all over again. The dance career she had spent nearly 6 years building toward was effectively over before it had truly begun. For a girl whose entire identity had centered on that goal, watching it vanish from a hospital bed was crushing. She later admitted that going back to school on crutches and being pitied by her classmates was one of the most unbearable parts of the entire ordeal. Her mother wasn't willing to let that be the end of her story. Since dancing was out of reach, Elma pushed her towards singing instead, arranging lessons with a local vocal coach and keeping her working even while she was still largely confined to a chair. Doris spent much of her recovery glued to the radio, singing along for hours, slowly realizing there was real potential in her voice. About 2 years after the crash that ended her dance ambitions, a Cincinnati bandleader named Barney Rapp discovered her, selecting her from a pool of more than 200 hopefuls who had auditioned, and offered her a steady spot at his brand new nightclub. It was Rapp who decided her German last name was too clunky for a marquee and suggested she adopt a stage name instead, eventually settling on Day, borrowed from a tune in her set list called Day After Day. In a strange twist of fate, the accident that nearly destroyed her future ended up redirecting her straight into the one that made her a legend. If this is pulling you in and you haven't followed old tapes yet, this is the moment to do it. We dig up the real, complete stories behind the golden age icons, the parts the old studio machine never wanted printed. From here, the distance between the public image and the private reality only grows wider. Everything about Doris Day's screen persona was engineered around a single formula: bright, wholesome, unshakably upbeat, the kind of woman who always ended up happy no matter what life threw at her. Studios built that image with surgical precision, because in the years right after World War II, audiences were desperate for exactly that brand of comfort. Doris slid into the role effortlessly, and the studios kept her there, casting her over and over in featherlight romantic comedies that reinforced the same package again and again. The catch was that the persona had almost nothing to do with who she actually was. Whenever Doris pushed for more serious dramatic work as her career matured, the studios pushed back. It was simpler and more profitable to keep giving audiences the version they already loved. So she kept performing the same character on screen while her real life, filled with abuse, financial deception, and a loneliness that never fully lifted, stayed locked away from public view. The people running her career knew exactly how wide that gap had become. They just had no interest in closing it, because what was truly happening off-camera would have been almost impossible for fans of that era to square with the woman lighting up their movie screens. Her first marriage set that pattern early. In 1941, at 19 years old, she married a trombone player named Al Jordan, a musician she had met through his band. By her own later account, his temper showed up almost immediately. Within about a day of the wedding itself, things spiraled quickly from there. Multiple accounts describe Jordan as fiercely jealous and quick to turn violent, again and again. When Doris became pregnant and made it clear she planned to keep the baby against his wishes, the situation only escalated, and she has said she was physically assaulted by him while pregnant. Their son Terrence was born in 1942, and Doris carried him while living in what she later described as a household ruled by fear. The marriage didn't last much longer than a couple of years before she gathered the strength to walk out, taking her infant son with her, and starting the long, difficult process of rebuilding from nothing. That kind of damage doesn't just disappear once you leave. Doris carried the weight of that first marriage for years afterward, and by her own admission, it permanently shaped how carefully she approached love and trust going forward. A short second marriage to saxophonist George Weidler in 1947 didn't involve violence, but it didn't last either, reportedly because Weidler struggled watching her career grow far bigger than his own. She has said he ended the marriage through a letter rather than a real conversation. Then came the marriage that would define both the height of her career and the depth of the betrayal that came with it. In 1951, she married Martin Melcher, who quickly became not just her spouse but her agent and the person overseeing nearly every financial and professional decision in her life. For a long stretch, it looked like a genuinely solid partnership. Doris threw herself into acting, singing, and recording, leaving her husband to manage the money and contracts entirely, while she focused on the work itself. From the outside, it appeared to be a real team. What she didn't know was that Melcher had handed almost all of her finances over to a Beverly Hills attorney named Jerome Rosenthal, a man he trusted with almost no oversight for nearly 2 decades. The two of them worked out of neighboring offices and were in constant contact, sometimes daily, across roughly 18 years. Rosenthal funneled Doris's earnings, estimated at around $20 million during the peak of her career, into a series of shaky investments, speculative land bonds, struggling hotel properties, uncertain oil and gas deals, arrangements a later court would describe as tangled in conflicts of interest and hidden kickbacks. Doris later explained that she trusted Rosenthal simply because her husband trusted him completely, and at the time she had no reason to question either of them. Then, in 1968, Martin Melcher died without warning, and everything unraveled. It was only after his death that Doris and her son Terry started combing through the finances and uncovered just how badly things had gone. Instead of the fortune she believed she had spent 2 decades building, she found herself buried under several $100,000 in tax debt, sitting on top of a financial foundation that had been quietly gutted for years without her knowledge. Even her own recording contracts, it turned out, had been borrowed against for albums she hadn't yet recorded. The money already gone by the time she found out. And to make things worse, she discovered that Melcher had signed her, without asking her or telling her, to headline a brand new television series, The Doris Day Show, apparently to help paper over the financial hole he and Rosenthal had created. With filming set to begin only weeks after she learned about the commitment, Doris took the fight to court, and her case against Rosenthal turned into one of the longest-running pieces of civil litigation in California's history, dragging through a 99-day trial and years of appeals afterward. In 1974, a judge ordered more than $22 million in damages for fraud and malpractice. A figure later bumped past $26 million once punitive damages were factored in on appeal. The judge presiding over the case called the entire arrangement riddled with conflicts of interest from start to finish. Her son later said publicly that she never actually collected anywhere near that full amount, eventually receiving only a partial payout years afterward through an insurance settlement. Rosenthal fought disbarment for nearly 2 more decades before finally losing his law license in 1987. What that betrayal cost Doris went far beyond money. It cost her the belief that handing someone your complete trust could ever really be safe. She rebuilt from there anyway. She took on the Doris Day Show, a commitment she never chose for herself, and used it over the following 5 seasons to re-establish both her career and her finances. Looking back, she came to see the entire episode as a brutal but necessary lesson, that even real love and real trust still need oversight, because blind faith placed in someone else's hands can quietly cost you absolutely everything. And underneath all of that financial wreckage, something else entirely was wearing her down. Despite the fame, despite the mountains of fan mail and awards and decades of adoration from around the globe, Doris Day was by most accounts a genuinely lonely woman. The very fame that made millions of strangers feel like they personally knew her made it nearly impossible for her to build the kind of real, unguarded friendships she actually craved. Every interaction, every relationship, every conversation carried the weight of being watched. And being watched constantly is nothing like being truly known. Her romantic history only deepened that isolation. The violence of her first marriage combined with the financial betrayal of her third left her, according to people close to her, guarded and slow to trust anyone fully again. A fourth marriage, to restaurant owner Barry Comden in 1976, ended in divorce a few years later, reportedly because Comden felt she poured more love into the strays and animals she was constantly rescuing than she ever did into him. What she wanted more than anything was genuine companionship. She said so herself in later interviews. describing a persistent emptiness even at the peak of her fame. She had the accolades, she had the fan letters. What she said she rarely had for long stretches of her life was someone real to lean on. A lot of that longing worked its way into her music. Sera in particular became something far bigger than just a hit song for her, a kind of gentle acceptance of a future nobody can fully control, sung by a woman who had lived through more genuine uncertainty than her bright screen image ever suggested. Later in her life came a loss heavier than anything that came before it, tied to a strange and largely forgotten footnote that almost no one connects back to her. Her only son Terry, born during the turmoil of her first marriage in 1942, grew up mostly shielded from the chaos Doris had lived through, and eventually built his own respected career as a record producer, working with major names in the music industry, including the Byrds. Doris was deeply proud of everything he accomplished, especially given how rough his earliest years had been. In the late 1960s, Terry was renting a house on Cielo Drive in Beverly Hills, a property that actually belonged to Doris. When he moved out in 1969, the house's next tenants were director Roman Polanski and his wife, actress Sharon Tate, who would be murdered there later that same year in one of the most notorious crimes in American history. Terry Melcher was pulled into the edges of that investigation because of his earlier connection to the house and to Charles Manson, whom he had briefly considered as a musician before turning down a record deal with him. It remains one of the strangest and least known threads tied to Doris Day's family, a brush with one of the darkest chapters in Hollywood history that had nothing to do with her own work at all. Terry moved past that unsettling episode and kept working in music for years afterward. But in 2004, doctors diagnosed him with skin cancer. Doris watched him fight the disease for months, and that November he passed away at 62. For a woman who had already survived an abusive marriage, a devastating financial betrayal, and years of quiet isolation behind a very public smile, losing her son stands, by every account, as the single most painful chapter of her entire life. In the years afterward, Doris pulled back almost completely from public life, settling permanently in Carmel, California, where she had already spent years building the Doris Day Animal Foundation, an organization she launched in the late 1970s that grew into one of the most significant animal welfare charities linked to any figure in Hollywood history. She rarely gave interviews and almost never appeared publicly, pouring what energy she had left into rescuing and caring for animals, as if channeling a lifetime of grief into something that could still make the world a little better. She died in Carmel on May 13, 2019 at 97 years old, having outlived nearly every one of her peers from Hollywood's golden age. So here's the real answer behind why men loved Doris Day. What they loved was a performance. A flawlessly built, expertly delivered performance of a woman who was cheerful, dependable, and endlessly hopeful, engineered by studio executives who understood exactly what post-war America was desperate to see. What almost none of them ever got close to knowing was the actual person underneath it all. A teenager who rebuilt her entire future after a train nearly cost her a leg. A young wife who survived violence nobody around her suspected. A star financially betrayed by the very men she trusted most. And a mother carrying grief that never fully lifted, all while smiling for cameras that had absolutely no idea what they were actually looking at. So here's what I want to know from you. Out of everything Doris Day quietly endured behind that smile, what surprises you the most? The accident that nearly ended her career before it started, the abuse she survived without anyone knowing, or the fortune that disappeared right under her nose? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one.